Hola, econ peeps. It's your intrepid professor here to deliver Module 7. Before I get started, I apologize for the last one. I know it was a long one. Most of the ones before this, remember, typically my classes are an hour and 20 minutes long. Most of the other lectures were less than 45 minutes long? So, I had built up, I would think, some goodwill by not dragging them on an hour and 20 minutes needlessly. So that one was a particularly substantive one, and I offered some additional information that perhaps you were or were not interested in. I don't know. But nonetheless, I suspect this one will go fairly fast and won't be quite as long. So I will try to recover some of the goodwill I had. So today we're going to talk about unemployment and inflation, all in one lecture. All right. So it's important to understand that being unemployed is not defined as just simply not having a job. Lots of people don't have a job that are not included in our unemployment rate. For example, college students. Many of them don't work. Some do. Many of them don't. They're not counted as unemployed. People retire. They're not counted as unemployed. We were fortunate early on that my wife was able to stay home with our son for the first 3 years of his life. She was not considered unemployed. Arguably, she worked harder than I did. But nonetheless, she didn't get paid like I did. Excuse me. So, the way we consider unemployed is you have to be both out of work and actively looking for a job. So, when we start talking about unemployment, it's important that you understand there are discouraged workers, those who have stopped looking for employment due to the lack of suitable positions available, or just general discouragement. They are not considered unemployed. I'm not sure why they put this under the heading of who counts in unemployment. These are people who don't count as unemployed. All right. So, discouraged workers, out of people who are not in the labor force. Okay. If they are not working and not looking for work, then they are not considered unemployed. They are not in the labor force. All right. Give me just a second. I'm going to turn my phone off. So I apologize. My son's best friend has stopped by, and that triggered my ring bell, and hopefully that won't bother us again. All right. And then there are those who are underemployed, people who perhaps do have a job, but they work fewer hours than they would like. Okay. Or people who are in a job that is below their skill level. Right. They have had to accept something that is less than what they would want. All right. So, to be in the labor force, you have to either be employed or unemployed and actively looking for a job. If you are one of those two, you are considered in the labor force. So the labor force is simply the sum of the employed plus the unemployed. Again, the labor force is simply the employed plus the unemployed. Okay? That is your labor force. All right? And so you can see from the pie graph that you have 151 million working, 7 million unemployed, and 94.4 out of the labor market. All right? Out of the labor force. Now, to calculate unemployment, I'm sure they'll show you this in a moment, you just simply take the ratio of the unemployed to the labor force. So in this case, with 151.4 million employed, 7.7 million unemployed, you add that up, you end up with 159.1. And so you take 7.7 out of 159.1 and multiply by 100 to convert it to a rate, and you have the unemployment rate. So let me bring up my spreadsheet real quick, and you can see kind of what I'm talking about. All right. So I frequently use a spreadsheet to do math when I'm at the computer. So let's just do 159.1, as I said, and the unemployment rate is going to be this number divided by that number, multiply that number by 100, and it's 4.9, basically 4.9%. All right. Oh, I don't need to, sorry. Let's just take that one and convert it to a percentage and give me a couple extra decimal points there. 4.84%. That's the unemployment rate. Okay, that's the unemployment rate. Here in, let's see, this was in, doesn't give a year, but I'm assuming this was pre-pandemic, probably 2016, 2017, maybe somewhere in there. Okay? There's another important calculation, right? It's the labor force participation rate. So this is really important, right? Because if our unemployment rate, typically the way we measure it, does not include people who are not working, who would love to have a job but just given up finding one. That should be remedied, if you ask me. Labor force participation rate kind of gives you a peek into that. If your unemployment rate is really low like it is now, but the labor force participation rate is low, that's one of the reasons why. There's just fewer people in the labor force. That's why. All right? So, labor force participation rate is the ratio of your labor force, unemployed plus employed, to your civilian non-institutionalized population above the age of 16. So, typically, we exclude anybody who is under the age of 16. If you're in the military, you're excluded. If you are in prison or otherwise unavailable because of hospitalization or long-term care or something of that nature, then you're not counted among even being available to work, right? So that would be our civilian. That's the group of people from which you can pull labor. But some of them aren't looking. Some of them aren't looking for legitimate reasons, like I said. Maybe it's a stay-at-home mom or dad. Maybe it's a college student who doesn't want to work because they don't absolutely have to. Or maybe it is a retiree, right? But there are also those other reasons why someone may not be in the labor force, but kind of wish they could have been and would have been, should have been, all right? So the labor force participation rate is that labor force, unemployed plus employed, divided by the total civilian non-institutionalized population over the age of 16. Okay? And again, the unemployment rate is simply the ratio of the unemployed to the labor force. All right? So there's your unemployment rate. So let's bring up my here. Let's see. Let's make this a little smaller here. And in this case, we have, so you'll see the total adult population over the age of 16 is 253. I don't know where I said 234. 159.1 million, or 63% of them are in the labor force, right? And that looks to me to be just the difference between these two numbers here. This is your labor force participation rate right there. 62.8 is pretty low. It had been over 65 prior to the financial crisis in 08. Been closer to 65, maybe even close to 66, 67, somewhere in that range. It began ticking up in the 70s as more and more women entered the labor market. But after the 2008 financial crisis, it's never recovered. And so our unemployment rate is skewed lower because of the lack of participation, arguably. All right, and so if you want to calculate the unemployment rate, there's you want, again, it's the same calculation, right? These are the numbers they got. And it's 4.84%. So, all right, my bad. Same numbers. The historical, there it was, right? There's the 4.8% that we calculated a minute ago. Okay, right there, 4.8%. All right, as we look at the data, several patterns stand out. Unemployment rates do fluctuate over time. In the late 90s and in the 2000s were rather low by historical standards. That's in this time frame here, right? When it creeped below 3, the unemployment rate never falls to 0, nor should it or would it. It's not really feasible that everybody's going, nobody's going to be looking for a job. The timing of rises and falls in unemployment. What? The timing of rises and falls? Wow. Sorry. Sometimes the errors here are absolutely breathtaking. That this was material given to me to present to a college class. The timing of these changes to unemployment match fairly well with the timing of upswings and downswings in the overall economy. Except remember, it moves in the opposite direction. So when unemployment rate is rising, that's because the economy is shrinking. And when the unemployment rate is falling, that's because the economy is growing. Okay? No significant upward or downward trend in unemployment rate is apparent. I don't know that. And you can kind of see it was still stubbornly high in about 2012, 4 years after the financial crisis, and we're still near double-digit unemployment. We're twice what it should have been, even at 4 years removed. But you can also see it was worse in some parts of the world. Italy, France, Sweden was right there with us, UK. So, and you can see historically we were doing better than most of them. So, we're back on track as far as the unemployment rate, but labor force participation rate still stubbornly, surprisingly, shockingly low. So that's the concern there. And again, as I've discussed before, labor, you can do supply and demand of labor. We've already talked about this. Instead of price over here, it's going to be wage. But when wages are flexible, I guess it's not at wage we, it's at wage sub E for equilibrium. They should use a star. That's the norm for the normal sort of nomenclature when we're creating these. We would do W star for equilibrium wage rate, W Q for equilibrium quantity, but it's fine. That's what the E stands for. It's not we, it's W sub E. And so this is where the equilibrium wage rate is right there. All right. So I don't know how they're going to present this, but there's 3 different types of unemployment. All right. One of those kinds of unemployment is known as cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is the kind of unemployment that occurs because of the business cycle, hence the name cyclical. Remember what I said. Unemployment moves in the opposite direction of output. So if output is increasing, if the business cycle is showing expansion, then you have lower rates of unemployment. When the business cycle turns downward, when you start seeing an economic contraction or a recession, unemployment's on the rise. Okay? And this change in unemployment is what we call cyclical unemployment. All right? It is unemployment closely tied to the business cycle, like higher unemployment during a recession. Okay? Efficiency wage theory, adverse selection of wage cut. These are not particularly useful models, in my opinion. They're not bad, and certainly at the next level, intermediate macro, I think that would be fine, but I think at this level, they're not particularly useful for an introductory economics class. It's just personal preference to me. But I've worked with efficiency wage theory and talked about that in further classes just to move past it, because I don't use it for nothing. I don't talk more about it. I don't talk too much more about it. It's just the theory that productivity of workers, either individually or as a group, will increase if they are paid more. And I don't think that necessarily holds up. There are other factors that impact that, right? So trust me, if something weird happens, when the economy contracts, productivity increases. Why? The theory is that as people realize the economy is contracting and more people are about to lose their job, they start working harder, hoping that it won't be them that loses their job. All right? And so I think that sort of contradicts the idea of efficiency wage theory, at least in some part and in some certain context. But I think it's definitely true that the better you pay people, the more productivity you can expect of them. I think that's reasonable. The problem is the more you pay them, the more it's going to cost you to produce your good or service, and the more you got to charge customers. And you run into that problem, right? All right, so I'll let the rest of that lie. Oh, poo. All right. The other types of unemployment. So, frictional unemployment. If there was such a thing as a good kind of unemployment, that would be this. It's the kind of unemployment that you get when the economy is doing so well that people leave their current job because they feel very strongly that they can find a better job. Right? So it's unemployment that occurs as workers move between jobs, right? Then there's structural unemployment. This is the worst kind of unemployment. It usually occurs because there is a mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers need, right? So if the folks in the labor market don't have the skills you need, you can't hire them. We're experiencing this right now in the airline industry, for example. I used to work at Tarrant County College. We have a pilot program there as well as an airline maintenance, aviation maintenance program that are highly competitive, difficult to get in. There's waiting lists. It's because there's only so much room for students, and there's a constant demand for these folks. It is a virtually guaranteed job, and it requires maybe 2 years of school instead of 4 or more. So something to keep in mind if you're interested in opportunities that don't require a whole lot of extra schooling. And so that's an example where there's not a lot of people out there with a skill set to work on airplanes and to fly them. And there's huge demand. There's a huge demand. There's a lack of supply of that kind of worker. Sounds clumsy. There's a real demand for people who can do that kind of work. How's that? Okay, that's structural unemployment. Now, instead of having to put this book up, I'm just going to get a piece of white paper from my printer here that won't have anything written on the back for you to see. And then I'm going to do something. All right. So, you will recall when we talked about business cycle. We're going to do output, which I'm going to label Y, over time. All right, let me go ahead and make the screen big for us so you can just see me. All right, there is that. Does everybody remember us talking about that the other day? Okay. Now, there's a couple of different names for that trend line, right? That line that goes straight through all of that we talked about the other day. I called it a trend line in my other diagram too, right? That straight line that kind of threads through that winding, snaking pattern that output follows because it's increasing and decreasing, hence the business cycle, right? So, remember, there's cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is that unemployment that changes as a result of that business cycle. This trend line happens to also be known as the natural rate of unemployment. Right? That happens to also be the natural rate of unemployment, that trend line, that straight line. It's also, by the way, known as potential GDP. Okay? Let me see if I can't bring this down enough to where we can actually all right, and then so pretty bad, but you get the idea. This is also would be actual GDP. Okay, so another name for that trend line is potential GDP, and that business cycle itself, we call that actual GDP, as it snakes around this trend line. That natural rate of unemployment is very important. If cyclical unemployment is the rise and fall of the economy, and that straight line is not doing that, then at every point along this, when the actual GDP equals potential GDP at every one of those points, that is when we are at the natural rate of I should say unemployment, but you get the idea, right? The natural rate of unemployment. This, by the way, is also known as, sorry, there's so many names for this, as full employment output. That is where we want to be. This idea of full employment output will become increasingly important as we move through this material. The natural rate of unemployment, potential GDP, full employment output level, full employment output level, something like that, however you want to say it. That's going to become really important as we move forward. Okay? All right. So let me get my big old mug out of here. All right. And you can see the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that exists in a growing and healthy economy from the combination of economic, social, and political factors that exist at a given time. It is simply frictional and structural. It can't be cyclical. So it's frictional and structural. It's a good kind of unemployment. Frictional typically occurs when the economy is doing so well, people leave their current job because they think they can get a better one. All right? They're so confident. Structural is just bad. It can be tough to overcome, right? And without retraining and all this stuff. Okay? All right. The natural rate of unemployment includes only frictional and structural unemployment, no cyclical. Full employment, that's what I was talking about, full employment output, and potential real GDP. Okay? Unexpected shifts in productivities can have an extraordinary effect on the natural rate of unemployment. It's not set in stone. It's not a constant. Even though I drew that line as straight, fairly straight, that's not really how it goes. It can shift. Not much, but it will, right? Then on the supply side of the labor market, there are public policies that can help people who don't have a job become more, find the necessary, develop the necessary skills, learn the necessary skills to be more marketable in the labor market, right? To get over, to not be structurally unemployed. How's that? And then, of course, on the demand side, there are government rules and other things that presence of a union that can affect willingness of firms to hire. Say what you want about unions. They create as many problems as they solve, in my estimation. There is a problem here. And unions have a vested interest in keeping the supply of labor low, which keeps upward pressure on wages. So in some ways, unions can be the enemy of people who are interested in getting into areas. But we'll leave that for another day. Feel free to email you if you disagree. All right. The natural rate of unemployment in recent years, some of the economic, social, political factors that determined it, these can change. The internet has provided an extraordinary new tool, and it makes it much more efficient for job seekers to find jobs they're qualified for. That's now already been mapped into the process, and there's just no more gains to be gotten from that. That's already there. The growth of the temporary work industry has probably helped to reduce the natural rate of unemployment some, and the aging of the baby boom generation has left a lot of holes there for us to come up and fill, which is why, Elon Musk is frequently talking about collapse of civilization and things of this nature, and part of that has to do with the concern about population. Population growth is not rising, and we're going to run out of people who can replace aging workers. Japan's been experiencing this now for 20 or 30 years. Some are suggesting we're going to be dealing with this pretty quick. Hyperinflation is that extremely high rate of inflation, right? Usually we're talking hundreds or thousands of percent. I'll give you an example. About 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 tops, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was estimating that hyperinflation in Venezuela was going to reach over 1 million%. That's really bad. Inflation is generally this ongoing increase in the prices, right? This ongoing rise in the level of prices. So you can see when we compare the 45-year time span between 1970 and 2014, just how much prices have changed, right? Remember, after this lecture, I'm going to be talking to you about the next lecture we do is going to be on cost of living. And I'm going to make an argument that not only has the cost of living not risen, but it has fallen. Despite what you're seeing here, we will get there, all right? While inflation has certainly eroded the purchasing power of our money, we all have more money, generally speaking, on average. Okay, so, all right. So how do you calculate inflation? Again, it's with an index number, all right? So here's how this works. The Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates something known as the Consumer Price Index. There are a host of price indices, by the way. Producer Price Index and many, many others. There's even one out there called the Big Mac Index, by the way. But the Consumer Price Index is the official one the government uses to measure inflation. And here's how this works. Theoretically, pretend for a moment that you go to the grocery store and you buy a very specific set of items, sort of standard items that most urban consumers would be purchasing: bread, milk, etc. You go to checkout, you keep your receipt. You go back 1 year later, same exact store, you buy the exact same goods, and you keep your receipt and you check out. You then compare these two receipts. The goods that you purchased, that's known as a market basket, right? And when you compare those two receipts, you're going to find out that the value of the market basket has changed in that year. And you can do this on a month or week to week or whatever you're looking for. Typically, inflation gets reported on an annualized basis. So don't freak out when you hear inflation is 8% this month. That does not mean that it's increased 8% since last month. God knows that would be really bad. That's closer to hyperinflation. That means that it's increased less than 1% from last month, but over 12 months, multiplied by 12, you get 8%. That kind of thing. Okay? So keep that in mind. All right. So that's your index values. And so you use the value of a market basket and you peg it to some base year. There's that base year idea again we used with GDP deflator, right? That we used with real GDP and nominal GDP. Now we're going to use it in terms of this market basket. So if we want to know how much it's changed, there's a way of calculating our index, our CPI. And then what we're looking is inflation is the percentage change in our index. We will see this in a moment. All right, so we'll use a base year. It's just arbitrary year. Value is an index number. It's always going to be 100. The base year's index value is always 100. This makes it easy, right? So if the next year you calculate your CPI and it comes up to 105, 1 year removed from the base year, inflation grew 5% over that year. Okay? It's that simple. All right. Let's see. Nothing more I want to talk too much about there. Price level is just the sort of average prices, right? Just kind of a generalized way of viewing the current value of things generally. The higher the price level, the more things cost on average, right? So, and you can see using 1990 base year as your base year, how much higher education has increased by. That is what happens when you subsidize demand. When you pay people to go buy something like they do with Pell Grants and loans, you are basically increasing demand, and so price is going to go up. There's no way around that. Same with healthcare. To the extent that we subsidize demand for healthcare. Now, you may say, well, wait a minute, healthcare isn't something you subsidize demand for. You're either sick or you're not. Very true. But guess what? It turns out people who have good healthcare tend to go to the doctors a lot more than everybody else for every little minor detail. They've got the sniffles. They've got a cold. They bruise their arm. Whatever it may be, off they go. And tying up those kinds of healthcare resources comes at a cost, right? There's only so much to go around. That's part of the problem with that people are wrestling with, right? So, all right. So here's the 8 major categories that are in our market basket: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education, communication, and other goods and services. And so when something like education increases dramatically fast, the cost of education increases dramatically faster than the cost of everything else, it can skew your CPI, make inflation look much worse than it is. That's one of the knocks on the way we calculate it. So the core inflation index is a version of the CPI that excludes these volatile economic components. Energy. I don't think food prices are all that volatile. But as the quality of goods get better, new goods get invented, the price of those goods begin to naturally increase, reflecting their higher value. And so the CPI sometimes overstates the cost of living, since some of the price increase it measures represents better value and not higher cost alone, anyway. There's also something called substitution bias. As one good or service becomes more expensive relative to others, consumers tend to substitute away from the more expensive item. We talked about that in the supply and demand chapter, right? That's one of the non-price determinants of demand, is if the price of a substitute good changes. How does that affect the demand for the good it's a substitute for? All right? And so because people, to the extent there's a lot of competition and there are substitutes for some of the things you want, then if something you want has gotten more expensive, you will substitute it away. And that, too, can lead to CPI overstating cost of living. All right. So we're repeating ourselves in this slide. I may lose power, so I apologize if that happens. Let's just hope it doesn't. All right. Core inflation index excludes those volatile components. Cost of living represents how much it costs for a person to feel that their consumption provides a level of satisfactory utility. The problem is we're rarely satisfied, always longing for more. That has that's a good thing and a bad thing, one could argue. Talked about substitution bias. And again, CPI tends to understate our standard of living. All right. There's also an employment cost index, which estimates the average cost of labor compensation. GDP deflator, producer price index I mentioned. So there's lots of these, right? Remember the GDP deflator, producer price index. Producer price indexes those prices for different industries, commodities, and stages of processing. It's the intermediate stuff, right? It's oil and all the different input resources that go into producing. The cost of those changes, they're tracking that. There's a way of calculating that index, at least approximately. Problems with inflation, right? So your retirement accounts, sometimes if inflation arises faster than your savings, that can be a problem. Excuse me, I have a weather bulletin on my phone, so that I better check. My son's very scared of bad weather, so yeah. Severe thunderstorm warning in my area right now. So this is filmed on September 4th here in DFW. I'm in Azle, northwest corner of Dallas-Fort Worth, and so we're having some weather today. All right, a pension is another type of retirement account, right? If the nominal interest rate, so your interest rate is made up of two components. Remember what I said, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing money. There are two different pieces of your interest rate, right? There's the expected inflation, right? There's what they think inflation will be over the life of this loan that you're wanting to borrow. This money that you're wanting to borrow, however long it takes, they give you to pay that back. What do they think inflation is going to be? That you need to at least cover the cost of inflation. If inflation rises faster than what they expected at, you're essentially paying that loan back in cheaper dollars, right? And then there's also the real interest rate, which is after inflation is taken into account. So real interest rate is nominal minus expected inflation. So really your nominal interest rate is your real plus expected inflation. All right. So with that in mind, those are the two components. And that real is going to include a couple of different things. For example, there's a cost associated with people making loans, with banks making loans, right? There's somebody has to process that paperwork. Somebody has to verify that you have the income and credit score to support the loan, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a cost associated with making that loan available to you. They have to recover those costs. Plus, they want a little something extra in there for their troubles. So expected rate of inflation and then these additional costs, we call that real interest rate up there. All right. Yeah, inflation can make it difficult to figure out, right, that price signal from supply and demand can make it very difficult to figure out exactly how much this thing costs. If inflation rates are too high, it becomes difficult to know exactly how much a good or service is going to be. By the time you get to the store, when in Venezuela, when it's 1,000,000% inflation, goodness gracious, by the time you get to the store, the price of whatever it is you wanted has already changed again. It's also difficult for producers and retailers. How much do they charge for it if it's changing that fast? So it can really start to affect how these goods get allocated. Right? It can have unintended purchasing power can be redistributed in some pretty negative ways, and it makes planning very difficult. People who hold a lot of cash, that's inflation. This is the myth that I hear a lot. Wealthy people hoard their income. They hoard their wealth. Nonsense. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of it. Nobody sticks their money under the mattress anymore. And if it's in a bank, it's in an interest-bearing account, and the bank can loan that money out, and that's the next business loan. That's the next venture capital. That money's not sitting there being hoarded by any stretch of the imagination. Okay? Nobody does that. They want to put it in an interest-bearing account if they're planning on holding it very long because they don't want inflation to erode its purchasing power. They put it in a bank, getting interest, so that at least the interest that they're being given on that money they deposit usually is going to exceed, on average, inflation over the life of that deposit. Right? And by the way, any financial asset it can be adversely affected by inflation. If the return on that if the nominal return of that investment is not keeping pace with the rate of inflation, you are losing money on it. Right? All right. Right. Inflation rates of 2, 3, 4%. 2 is the 2 to certainly 2.5 tops is probably ideal, somewhere in that range. It's enough to discourage hoarding, you could argue, but not so high that it's difficult for people to keep up with. 3, 4% is not that bad either. But if there's a lot of variability, and then those moderate and high inflation rates can become a bigger problem. And low inflation, something we call disinflation, D-I-S, disinflation, is much better than deflation. We don't want deflation. We do not want deflation, and that can happen in a pretty bad recession. Things can start losing value. You may think that's a good thing, but I promise you it's not. It makes it very difficult for producers to make money, and if they can't make money, they can't hire you. If they can't hire you, then where are you going to work? They may have to start getting rid of people because they're not going to be bringing in as much because things aren't worth as much. It's a huge problem. It's not good. Deflation is not better than inflation. It's not as bad as a really high rate of inflation. Disinflation is ideal. We had disinflation for a long time. All right, there is our quick review, right? They did not give you the calculation for the CPI, so let me write this down. I don't know if it'll be a part of your, if I included it in homework assignment. I don't think they had too many questions about this, but your CPI in some year, I'll call it sub Y, is the value of your market basket in the base year divided by the value of the market basket in whatever year. Yeah, this is not going to work too well. I'm going to use sub B for base year and sub Y for just whatever year you're wanting it. And you want to multiply that by 100. All right? So that would basically be, let me go ahead and make my screen big, just in case you want this or want to know this much detail. It may be more than, typically this is something that's included in the introductory class, but this book doesn't really deal with this much. But CPI is the value of the market basket in the base year, divided by the value of the market basket in year Y, or whatever year you're looking for. You multiply that by 100. It's not a percentage. It's an index value. But if you want to then find your inflation rate, right? So inflation is going to be the CPI, we'll call this CPI new minus CPI old divided by CPI old times 100, and that times 100 there is a percentage. See that? You can pause that and write that if you want that. Now, so again, if you're just measuring the inflation rate from the base year, that's easy. But if you're measuring the inflation rate of, the difference between the inflation of 2 different years, before or after the base year, then you need that calculation. It's the same growth rate formula that we've used all along, right? New minus old divided by the old every time. Okay. Anyway, folks, I hope this was more to your liking. Shorter. It's still 41 minutes long, but still much shorter than the last one, Chapter 6. So I do apologize for that. Be sure and do a quick review if you think you need it. Couldn't hurt. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. Otherwise, folks, be safe, be kind. Thanks for your indulgence, and y'all have a wonderful day.